It may feel impossible, but the word chat was kind of an important point for this presentation, because for this to have some personal meaning to you, I'd really like to try and do this almost Phil Donahue style. So unless I land on my face tripping over these chords, as I'm going through this, when I'm on a slide that is of particular interest to you, or you have a question, or you don't understand, I'd really like to make it interactive throughout the presentation, as well as leave plenty of time at the end for questions that you have. There are microphones located halfway down the aisle. Ron is going to be the co-host here and with the roaming mic, so please feel free to jump in at any time. I suspect that the turnout for this topic is probably because of all of the issues or systems that you talk about implementing that are consistent with Dr. Deming's teachings. The one that has a lot of logical appeal and yet really bothers you in your gut is what do you do with the reward system? And maybe before I even get started talking, I'll elaborate a little bit on the Halloween story, because in my mind it really drove home why in my gut I had a hard time turning my whole thinking around, and why all of you will probably have the same kind of issue to deal with if you haven't already. About a year ago, when my daughter was 3 years old, we took her to the zoo in our community around Halloween. And we didn't know this, but there was a Halloween costume contest taking place when we got there. And it was a very fascinating process to watch, where there were 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds parading in their little costumes around a circle of an audience of parents and people in the community watching. They were all dressed up, and as you can imagine at that age, their faces were very bright, very open and excited about what they were doing. And that lasted for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, the narrator came up and announced 3rd place, 2nd place, and 1st place. And there were 3 children left then in that group that had bright faces. The remaining children brought home for me personally exactly what Dr. Deming's been trying to teach us. Their faces were sad, they were disappointed, and they're very young. And at that age, we're already starting the indoctrination process of competition, of somebody wins and somebody loses, and the destruction that can go along with that. So he kind of adopted that little story, and if you attend one of his more current 4-day seminars, he plays that into his whole message around the destruction of people. And it's a very, as Ron said, a very personal thing that it brought it all home for me. Some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that in the book where the presentation is, only half of that material is what I'll be using. That's the bad news. The good news is that the half that I'm not using is focused on a replacement for appraisal systems, which is not what I'm going to be talking about, but at least you'll be able to walk away with that information. What I will talk about is the design of a compensation system that is consistent with Dr. Deming's teaching. So the good news is you'll walk away with 2 elements of a people system and a little bit of information on that. One other background piece I'd like to go over is where we're located strategically, I guess, or structurally within the General Motors system, because we're a pretty large company and it's hard to put that in perspective. I am with the General Motors engine division. That's pretty self-explanatory that we design and manufacture all the engines for General Motors. That puts us, if we were to pull ourselves out of General Motors and look at it on the Fortune 500 list, that we would rank about 42 in total sales. We have 14 plants that cover 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So it's a fairly big operation with 4,000 salaried employees and 33,000 represented employees. So if that helps you put it in perspective, even keeping that in mind, we're a small piece of General Motors. So when you heard some of the discussions yesterday morning about working on a system within a system, that's where we are. In spite of the size that I just shared with you, we have only a certain amount of control over what we can do with our resources and our systems. So trying to work inside of that environment has been quite a challenge. With that, let me open up into the topic that you came to hear about. The subject today, again, is primarily on compensation systems, but what I'd like to share is our view, and I hope yours, that all of the systems in the arena of people systems are very much interrelated. You can't change one without impacting another. And all of those systems should evolve around, for your organization, a core set of beliefs and values. Which means, at least in our mind, that step one is coming to terms with what those values and beliefs are. And many organizations skip over that step and start working right into systems maybe that they've adopted from other companies because they've been successful somewhere else. Pay for performance is a national trend. Most companies are on pay for performance. But if you're adopting some of the Deming teachings and principles into the other aspects of your business, and you continue on with a strong pay-for-performance system, you've got an obvious disconnect. So the first issue to deal with is, what do you believe? What are the values in your organization? We started to do this back in about 1985 when we began working with Dr. Deming. And of course, you all know what his primary message is around ratings. And the initial reaction to that is to just do away with appraisal systems. How many are in a company where you've taken that kind of step? Okay, just a couple. That's an initial reaction, but what we learned over time is that you can't just do away with that. There's a very important element in appraisal systems that are focused on employee development. Now, for many of us, that aspect of performance appraisal is completely lost because that appraisal drives too many other systems. It determines your increase. It determines whether or not you get promoted. It determines if, in some organizations, if you're going through a downsizing effort, who's going to be laid off and who's going to stay. It determines who's going to lose their job. It drives everything. And so the one thing that it can't drive effectively is employee development, because both the supervisor and the employee are too focused on what the outcomes are going to be of that rating. Well, the first step that we took in this wheel, based on working with Dr. Deming for 2 years, was to do away with appraisals but replace it with an employee development system. Some of the information you have in your booklets will talk about the key features of that system. When we did that, we eliminated the overall performance rating. Now, obviously, we have a lot of other holes when we do that, and the first thing we had to address was compensation systems. So again, that's what we'll be talking about today, is how could you design a compensation system consistent with the teachings and not use ratings. We took that issue and broke it into two fundamental questions. And I'd ask you to continue to think about these two questions as I go through this presentation and answer them in relation to what you think or what you believe. The group of people who designed this system were both technical and non-technical people from all functions. Some were supervisors and some were just recipients of the system that we were designing. The questions we asked ourselves are, can we accurately and fairly distinguish contribution? So that's an issue of, do we know how to do it? That'll be one question we'll try and answer. The second question is, assuming that you can, if you're one of those managers who believes that in spite of all the potential pitfalls of doing evaluations, that you personally have the skill to separate biases in your judgment and to rank or evaluate people, if you believe that's true, the second question you need to ask is, when you look at your organization, is it worth it? When you weigh the upside and the downside of going through that process. So this presentation will focus on answering both of those questions. We first wanted to get a little bit of feel of the whole issue of variation and how that might play into our assessment of contribution. So this is just a little quote that set our group in a common focus of what it was we were trying to accomplish. And I'll just focus on this last piece, which is a quote from Dr. Deming. Variation is a product of any system, and management's job is to study the variation with proper theory to unravel the message that the variation is trying to tell us about how to improve the process. The focus, again, becomes on improving the process rather than on evaluating a particular individual's contribution. When we look at our ability, this is answering the first question of, can I accurately and fairly distinguish contribution? These are some of the issues that we felt factored into how you answer that question. First of all, probably no matter what job you have or have had in the past, there's some known outcome for what was accomplished, either good or bad. Probably people can step away and look at something that you've done and feel that that was good or it wasn't so good. So the question is not whether or not you see a result. The question is what you can attribute the result to. And in our view, it's a very difficult multivariable problem that might take into account some of these factors. We don't know necessarily the net value of any one of those factors leading to the outcome, and yet we try to do that. For example, the native ability and early education of the individual, what the worker's personal effort is or contribution, the training and orientation given to the employee, is it consistent from one person to the next coming into a new assignment? The variability and capability of the processes and systems within which the employee is operating. If you think of a production environment and you think of people moving from one job to the next, you could take the same individual, and probably you can think of cases like this, move them from one department to another, and you'll see very different results. It's not necessarily the individual that's making those differences. It could very well be in a production environment, again, the kind of resources, the kind of technical support they get, the kind of supplies that are purchased, and so on. Many things that are accounting for the known outcome that you eventually see. And then the system of evaluation, whether or not it's consistent from one evaluator to another. Have you had efforts in your own organization where you're attempting to deal with rating distributions that look like they're different from one function to another? And you're trying to get to the point where managers are working off of the same standards? That's just another piece of variability that go into the known outcome you observe. So if we turned it into an equation, we would just say that all of those factors lead to a known outcome. And we haven't yet learned how to separate out the different impacts that each one of those would have on what you observe. This is another, what we would call rater error. And again, I'd ask you to think of yourself when you look at this information. People take actions in any given job that they have. Sometimes you can see the results of those actions immediately. Sometimes it takes a while. Now that can be good or bad. People are either rewarded or penalized for that. But if the action that was taken was perceived to be good when person A did it, person A transfers, is promoted because of the actions they took. Person B comes in. And during the time that person B is there is when you begin to see the known outcomes of the actions that that first person took. Who is held accountable for the results? B. Now, some of you may have benefited from that in the past, and some of you may have been penalized for that. But most of us have experienced that. There's a time lag, so you don't really know whose performance you're observing, person A or person B. There are a lot of other concerns that we have that maybe get into a little bit of the psychology of evaluations, and it has to do with our ability, again, to evaluate contribution. Are we consistent from evaluator to evaluator? Are we equally tough or generous in how we appraise people? Are your organizations? Do we rate according to the Pygmalion effect? Now, the way we interpreted that is if someone were to transfer into your department, typically they bring with them a reputation of some sort, good or bad, strong or weak. They're very organized or they're not organized at all. They're very creative or they're not creative. They bring a set of expectations into your area. And very often, bringing those expectations into your area, you begin to adopt those, and that's how you view the person. And then they begin to behave that way again. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do we tend to favor those who are like us in terms of culture or race or sex or age? Now this is one that most of us feel that we've moved past this. We can separate all of that from our judgment. But we just went through a little seminar on workforce diversity. And it's very enlightening, the assumptions that you walk around with that you're not even aware you have. If I were to ask you to work in groups right now and describe people who are 25 to 30 years old that work in any environment, very quickly you're going to come up with a set of descriptions. And they might be things like, you're concerned about the complexity of the assignments that you can give them. They're not quite ready for that yet. They're naive. They might be more interested in their social life than they are in their professional life. There's a lot of things that we could articulate very quickly together. Now, the net result of that is what? When you have someone that age working for you, and you're not even aware that you have those assumptions, any idea of what happens? Do you not begin to structure the assignments you give them based on what you think they will or won't do? Maybe they're not as satisfied with the kind of work they're able to do because of the kind of willingness we have to give them complex assignments. People who are age 50 and over, any immediate assumptions that come into mind when you think of people that are 50 and older? I see a lot of heads nodding. Do you think it has anything to do with the kind of assignments you give those people, the kind of development you give those people, the way you treat them? Working women with young children. Some assumptions? Single women, no children. Minorities. Minority females, minority males. We all have assumptions. And I think we're probably at a point where we're beginning to realize that we have them, but that's about as far as we've gotten. We have not yet learned to separate that from our day-to-day interactions and our assumptions of people. And someday, hopefully, we will, but we aren't there yet. Even the most dedicated individual to being able to reward people that I know of believes that someday we ought to be able to do it, and he's going to design the performance system to reward people when he figures out how to get through all these biases. But even this person recognizes we aren't there yet. We have not yet learned how to overcome that. Now, we do try and design processes to overcome that bias that any one individual might have. And often it's called a multiple input process. If any one manager would go into an evaluation system and we know that there's a tendency for bias, we try and fix that by having people have to agree on what an individual's contribution is. Well, we maintain that introduces a whole new set of dynamics. And it has to do with how well your supervisor is perceived among the group of raters. Can that person sell you? Because if they can, that's probably the person you want to work for. You may have witnessed situations or even been part of situations where there's trade-offs that take place. I'll give you that one if you give me this one. And those are the dynamics that go on when we try and overcome individual judgment. Do the raters use the same criteria and weight them the same? Another attempt that we've had at trying to get to a common understanding so we can get objective in our process is, well, if we at least agree on what we're rating people on, and we have a definition that everybody understands, then that'll get us there. And we can even agree to weight them equally. Here's where another bias comes in. If I happen to be a manager that is, let's say, very organization-oriented, very maybe creative, process-oriented, but not very organized in terms of details. I may really value the kind of person working for me who's very organized because I need that. I need that counterbalance. So without even being aware of it, if I have two people working for me, one of them has the same strengths and weaknesses I do, the other one complements me where I'm weak, I'm going to favor that person. I'm not even aware of it. I'm trying to make everything equal, but those are all the things that start to filter into your judgment again. These are some of the things that we tried to look at for common criteria. But again, we concluded it's a very difficult issue, and we have not yet learned how to work through all of these biases in our judgment yet. Very open to ideas if someone has any thoughts, processes, or systems that you think have overcome some of the biases that we've identified. I guess in concluding and trying to work through some of the assumptions around evaluations, we felt that if an individual is to be rated or ranked, then these assumptions must hold true. And if they don't, we have no business doing it yet until we learn how to work through these. Personal effort and contribution of each individual can be correctly separated from the effects of the system. Training is adequate, and it's consistent from one person to the next, from one department to the next, from one function to the next. Coaching and leadership is adequate and consistent from individual to individual. Have you all had a lot of coaching when you've changed jobs, worked into new positions? Someone helping you through that initial process? If you have, you're unique. Most of us learn just by assuming the responsibilities and working through them ourselves. The effects of the system barriers can be correctly separated from the effects of the actions taken by the person. Carryover effects, that's the person A versus person B issue, can be correctly separated from the effects of the actions taken by the person being rated. Evaluator effects can be correctly separated from personal effort, contribution, or in other words, there are no evaluator effects to deal with. So the question that you needed to answer is, do these assumptions hold true? If they hold true for your organization, then go ahead and rate. If they don't, then some of the things that we've been trying to tell people are not true. That's really difficult in and of itself, is to admit to your organization when you've been telling them for years that you're on a pay-for-performance system and you're going to reward those people who contribute the most, to then go and admit to your organization that you really don't know how to do that is probably the most difficult step you can take, particularly if you remember that kindergarten story, because people want to believe you. They want to believe that you can tell the difference between them and everyone else, because we've raised them to be that way. This is just a little bit of data that we'd like to share with you on that might highlight or at least confirm some biases in our system. These are, if you would look at this as the top performance category on a 6-point rating system for the year 1987. And going horizontally are the levels of responsibility in our organization, with 8th level being a manager, 4th level being an entry-level position. Vertically, you'll see the percent of people who were rated in the top performance category on a 6-point scale. Do you notice anything? Sixth level, by the way, is the level of responsibility for a first-line supervisor, which is one of the largest populations that we have in our organization. Would anyone like to try and explain, knowing those two things, what's going on here?
We had an externally externally imposed formula for ranking in 1988 versus 1987.
Oh, that's good. He's already looked at 1988 and said we had an externally imposed formula for ranking. That's right. That is true, and I'll go into that in just a minute. But if we could look just at 1987, and the trend that you see there, particularly knowing that production supervisors are the largest piece of the population at level 6.
You're a manager, you know each other, so you rate yourself higher. Production supervisor, you've got the most responsibility, so it's most likely you're going to not perform.
Okay.
Everybody else about average.
You're blaming the supervisor for all your problems.
You have a forced distribution in each category. If you have fewer managers, some more than percentage-wise, it would be high.
We've had a lot of different thoughts up here. We've had blaming the supervisors for the environment they're working in. We've had managers at the 8th level evaluating each other and taking care of each other. A lot of different biases that I'm sure don't exist in your organization. But at the 6th level, let me elaborate just a little bit. In the production arena, those of you that evaluate and use ratings, do you use things like scrap and quality and housekeeping and productivity? Do you use any of those things? They are clear measures of performance, aren't they? They're really easy to rate people with because you either get it or you don't. Production supervisors were the group that was most vocal of eliminating ratings. They were saying crazy things like they were being held responsible for things that other people had a lot to do with. They were only a piece of the whole operation. They were completely dependent on what they received. They were completely dependent on the kind of technical resources that supported them. And yet they were being rated based on what went off their line. Now, yes, they had something to do with that. And we would never, and never do communicate to our organization that they don't have anything to do with what comes through their line or what any of us are responsible for. Sure they do. But they're not unilaterally responsible for what happens. But it was real easy to rate them. Very easy to rate them. Now the other bias that we would attribute, if you looked at that and just see the angle of the results, we would say that we have a real difficult time separating the value of a person's job from their overall rating. People who are in higher levels of responsibility have broader impact. And we tend to look at the job and its impact and rate the job as much as we're rating the person, and we would call that a level bias. And that data probably exists in your own organization if you've taken a look at it. Now you can try and fix that, and you'll see in 1988 we tried to fix that. And this is where you have a smaller system called the engine division working within the corporate environment called General Motors. General Motors was tired of the fact that all of our people were rated in the top 2 categories on a 6-point scale. Our managers are not doing their job. They are not stepping up to the issue of performance and distinguishing people, so we're going to make them do it. So in 1988, we implemented a forced rating distribution. Now the rest of General Motors had a forced distribution that was the top 10%, the next 25%, the next 55%, and the bottom 10%. Now keep in mind, that's coming on the heels of years and years and years of people being told they were in the top 2 performance categories. We were far enough along in our work with Dr. Deming that we knew what was going to happen, and we didn't want to have anything to do with that. So we did at least arrive at a compromise position with the corporation. We were allowed to have 3 groupings of people. It's still forced distribution, 1988. But the 3 groupings were the top 10%, the middle 80%, and the bottom 10%. Now I'll go into what happened with that in a minute, but this is looking at the top 10%. Forced distribution. And the forced distribution guidelines, by the way, were by level. In the 8th level, you can have only 10%. 7th level, 10%. 6th level, 10%. Now you'll see, as you look at that distribution, that to the extent we could push that boundary, we did. At the 8th level, in a forced distribution where you could only identify the top 10%, we identified 15. And because we got away with it. And then 13 at level 7 and so on. So again, just another bias you might want to look for in your own systems. A little bit of psychology around ratings. If you believe, and I don't know that I disagree with this, but let's assume for a moment that if there were a way to accurately assess performance, that's a big if. But if there is a way to do that, let's assume that people perform or contribute along some kind of distribution, normal distribution like you see up there. So we have that as a starting point. We adopted something called the 80-30 pressure, which we picked up from In Search of Excellence. The 80-30 pressure is a simple theory that 80% of us believe that we're in the top 30% of contributors. You may want to poll a group of people sometime and ask that question. When I do this presentation often at Michigan State University, which is in our backyard. They have a school of labor and industrial relations, and there are people in that curriculum who study performance evaluations. And by the way, they're being told that pay for performance is the only way to go. I always ask them at the beginning to think of themselves in a work environment that they've been in. Most of these are grad students, so they've worked in one capacity or another. And think of themselves relative to the other people that they work with. And on a little slip of paper, just write down where you think you are compared to those people. Are you in the top 10%, the next 25%, the next 50%, or the bottom 10%? And I have found that this theory is not true. It's actually more like 95% of the people think they're in the top 35%. It's absolutely amazing. Now, I'm sure that's what allows us to go through life and succeed, because we think we're pretty good. I mean, our parents work hard at trying to make sure that we have a good self-image. I mean, if you're a good parent, that's what you want to do, isn't it? So it's good that we think that we're great. Well, managers, contrary to not stepping up to their job, perhaps are recognizing a motivational theory here, that if I tell somebody they're not as good as they think they are, I'm probably not going to get as much out of them. So if I have a 6-point rating distribution, and I'm wavering between rating somebody a 2, which is on the 1 being high, 6 being low, and I can rate them a 2 or a 3. I'm not sure which way to go. Most of the time, recognizing the impact it's going to have on that person, you'll weight that rating towards the high end in recognition of how they will behave subsequent to that. If you add to that another theory called the yearly growth pressure, this is just something we discussed in our group and came up with. That's just a theory that most of us think that we get, not only are we pretty good, we actually get better every year. So now think of that employee that works for you who is working up a storm, all kinds of effort. There's steam coming out of their office. There's nothing else coming out, but there's a lot of steam. And you have coached them and counseled them last year. Again, you rated them a 3 last year. And you've seen them work to try and respond to that feedback. They're really trying. Now, nothing's changed, but they tried awful hard. The next year, what are you going to rate them in recognition of that effort? Probably not a 3. You will probably, again, want to recognize the effort of the person, keep their motivation going, and you'll probably rate them a 2. That, by the way, is the actual performance distribution in our organization when we stopped rating people. We had about 75% of our people rated 1 and 2. Now, we've, through the years, tried to fix that. We used to have a 5-point rating system, and everybody was rated a 1 and a 2. So we put a 6-point system in there, thinking that we'll spread out that distribution. And that worked for about a year, and then it started to ease up again. Our conclusion is that without a forced distribution, consciously or unconsciously, managers are going to play into some of the things they believe about motivation, and over time, your distribution will always skew to the top end. What I've shared with you so far, haven't even gotten into compensation, but just some of the theories and thoughts that we had about why we wanted to minimize performance distinctions among people. We questioned that first question about accuracy and fairness. A lot of the people in our group felt very strongly that we could not separate out the system impact from the person's contribution, and that we certainly had a lot of inconsistencies or biases in our judgment. So the answer to the question of can you accurately and fairly distinguish contribution, for a lot of people in our group was no, you can't. Now there are still some diehards out there who say, I heard everything you said, and a lot of other people can't do it, but I can. We had people like that in our group as well. They got to the second question, though, of is it worth it? And after watching what happened with the forced distribution throughout General Motors, there was no question but that it wasn't worth it. When you take an organization that went from a free expression kind of rating system and force a distribution, where most of the people for the first time are going to hear that they're not as good as they thought they were. Matter of fact, they're down in that 55% group when in the past they were in the top rating category, which happened frequently. Do you know that there were grown men crying? All in the interest of trying to improve in General Motors, trying to get maximum productivity out of our people. We went the wrong direction. At a time when we needed to pull together, we started to destroy each other. The value to powertrain, it avoids demoralizing and demotivating people. It reduces internal competition. It doesn't eliminate it, but at least we can remove some of the focus on one person winning at the expense of someone else. We hope that it increases collaboration. It certainly recognizes that there's a limited correlation between our assessment of contribution and someone's performance, but a difficult message to communicate to your people. It avoids all the administrative problems that are associated with the skewing of rating categories. If you have all of your personnel systems driven off of an appraisal rating the way we did, and you're trying to can't identify candidates for a given opening based on their rating, well, when you got everybody rated in the top two categories, it really didn't help you, did it? You're trying to administer a pay-for-performance system when everyone's rated in the top two categories. What kind of a pay-for-performance system is that? We hope it promotes win-win, and this is a very important point. Undoubtedly, when we get into a point of having questions and answers, this is going to come up again. So I want to hit on it as best I can right now. We believe that pay is a very limited motivator, and that it can be a very significant demotivator. And what we mean by that is if you think of the most satisfying pay increase you ever received and how you felt, that good feeling and any boost in your performance as a result of that probably lasted a couple of weeks, and then it starts to diminish. But now think of a time when you got less than what you felt you were entitled to receive. That will stay with you all year because it wasn't fair. Now, in a pay-for-performance system, some people win at the expense of someone else. If you have a 4% fund, for someone to get 8%, somebody's not going to get anything. And again, if you're trying to drive your organization towards a common aim, you got to ask yourself if it's worth it to do that. The two questions, again, are now broken apart into two more questions. And this sets the stage for our compensation system. Question one, Can we today accurately and fairly distinguish exceptional versus solid contributors? And I'll share with you in a minute what we mean by exceptional. And does the value of doing so outweigh the potential negatives? To that question, we said yes. There still are some people out there who universally, we all agree, stand out. And I'm going to go into, again, a pretty detailed definition that we believe is consistent with some of Dr. Deming's teachings, and the results of the number of people we have who are exceptional will hopefully bear that out. So we answered yes to that question. Can you accurately and fairly further differentiate performance? And the question of, is there value in doing so? To that we answered no. And we had the wonderful experience of watching what happened in other divisions around us with 10, 25, 55, 10 to help validate that. Here's what we would describe as an exceptional contributor. An exceptional employee has inarguably stood out from the rest of the work team for a sustained period of time in contribution as defined by the personal operating principles. The personal operating principles to us were a detailed definition that focused more on the way you go about accomplishing your job rather than what you accomplish. So it's more the methods than the results. Is easily declared so by those that know him or her. It's consensus by acclamation, no debate. Exceptional, given its most elementary definition, is rare, and to identify more than a few individuals as such negates the exceptional label, makes it a non-tolerable contradiction. It is more likely that a given work team will have none rather than have one exceptional contributor. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this issue of exceptional contribution. I think we spent an awful lot of time in the design of a process to do this. The results are that we had in our division 4 exceptional contributors after going through this process. So they're clearly very, very few. There are 3 ways you can identify exceptional contributors. You can do it through free expression. You saw what our distribution looked like in 1987. When you do it with free expression, you tend over time to shift up to probably much larger number than what your definition would call for. You can also do it through a numerical control. You can only have 10%. Well, I don't need to tell you what the problems are with that. We've discussed it a little bit, and I'm sure you could elaborate on that yourself. That really left us with only being able to put in place a very clearly defined process, which we did do, involving teams of people, all who had to agree on who might be exceptional, and you can see what the results were. By the way, of those 4 people, there is no correlation, no data that you could look at that would conclude anything about sex, age, level, or anything. Or even people who in other systems are identified as exceptional, or excuse me, as having extreme long-term potential. The concept of our pay system is this. We have 2 funds. One is the base pay fund that rolls into your pay and continues to grow over time. The other is what we would call a lump sum fund that you would receive on a one-time basis. The concept of the base pay fund is that annual base pay is determined by what your current position and time in a pay range is, and then increases are calculated to an appropriate base pay. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute where that will make a lot more sense. Distinctions in pay based on contribution are limited to only those people who are identified as exceptional, and then we spend 90% of our base pay fund using this algorithm. We do reserve 10% for what we call non-contribution distinctions, and I'll go over that in just a minute. Did you have a question?
It seems that your system has a base assumption that all your participants in the evaluation procedure are compatible employees. If you have a system that does not have compatible employees, then when you say a person has to be outstanding, no debate, there's got to be some type of unifying principle set that those people that have the ability to debate the issue live by. Now, have you addressed the unifying principles, or is it just a matter of luck that you've got a system with people that are compatible?
Are you asking the question of people who participate in that decision or that discussion have to have knowledge of the individuals?
No, but just a compatible point of view as far as where the company's directions are going, what is considered ideal performance. You can always have one person in there that could stop a person from being an exceptional performer the way you've defined it. Do you have some way of working calibration?
Well, we have no scientific or formula-driven way to do that. We do have a very detailed explanation of what we call the personal operating principles, which may be what you're talking about. It's the same thing that everybody would look at as to what do we mean behaviorally about exceptional contribution.
That could be what I'm calling a unifying principle set, because that pulls the group together.
Yes.
As far as what you're looking
yes.
for. Now, is that part of your presentation, or is it something that you can make available to the people?
I can make it available to have it reproduced. No, it's not in here, but I'd be glad to do that.
Thank you.
Okay. Base pay, how it grows. This is probably something you could pick up in any journal where you could see that there's a correlation between experience and what people make. Maturity curves are very popular in the technical world, and this is probably just a very simplistic graphic of something like that. The thing that is important, though, in the design of our plan is that the shape of that curve. Earlier in time, most of us expect our pay to grow more rapidly than we do over time. Now, and I'm talking about, think of your career. You probably expected more rapid growth as you got out of school and started to work, or you experienced more rapid growth than you will at some point. At some point, you're going to achieve about where you're going to level off, and your pay will begin to reflect that in this kind of concept. We simply took that concept and laid it over a pay range. Now, there's a pay range for, I'm sure in your organization, for any given job classification you have, there's a pay range that has a minimum, a maximum, and then a midpoint associated with that. The midpoint is intended to be the level of pay that your company would determine to be competitive. So however you do that, and that varies from one to another, for us, we survey 30 companies that participate in what's called a conference board throughout the United States. That helps us to determine what is the competitive rate of pay for any given job classification. We also glean from that information what's the most that any company is willing to pay for someone who performs a given job. So that's how those are updated every year for us. We simply took that concept and said that over time, most people will see pay growth in their pay range in a way that is similar to that green line. It'll accelerate earlier in time, and it will level off above the competitive rate of pay, about halfway between the midpoint and the salary maximum. Exceptional contributors would simply move faster and penetrate further into the pay range, going all the way to the salary maximum. Now again, keep in mind, this is how 90% of the fund is spent. There's still 10% we haven't talked about yet. But the formula that drives the increase tries to look at pay growth along that concept. Now this is what the data actually looks like in a given pay range. You'll see there's quite a bit of dispersion there. This is a senior manufacturing engineering pay range, plotted along a time axis in dollars. You see all the dispersion in there? There's lots of reasons for that. Why one person at year 0 could be making about $3,100 a month and another one making about $4,500 a month. Same amount of time. Some of that is from an old rating system that drove increases, but you know what? That accounted for a very small amount of the dispersion you see. Most of it is attributed to what division you hired into when you joined General Motors. If you were hired into the old Cadillac organization, which is in Detroit, it's actually low because they didn't have to pay a lot to attract good people. People wanted to work for Cadillac just because it was Cadillac. But if you started at Buick, which was located in Flint, lower cost of living area, probably not a prime spot for attracting young talent, you tended to start at a higher base rate. And then, of course, that pattern perpetuated itself over time because increases were calculated as a percent of your base pay. So if you started a little ways apart, that distance, would increase over time. So a lot of what you see there has no relationship to the cost of living where the person worked. It has nothing to do with performance, and it has a lot to do with things that shouldn't have any meaning at this point in time. The system simply looks at where you were in that scatter plot, and it tries to drive you towards a curve in this concept. The further you are away from where you should be at a given point in time, the larger your base pay increase. We do not have a system where everybody gets the same increase. We have a system where the algorithm looks at experience and says that's very important. People believe that the more experience they have, the more they should make. So 90% of the fund is spent recognizing that concept. The 10% fund that I told you was on reserve. Now remember, we have two customers, and you would have two customers in the design of any compensation system. You have the employee customer, and they have one set of needs, and you have the manager customer who also has a set of needs. And typically the set of needs that the manager customer has is to be able to make some decisions or impact differences in people's pay. We've given them 10% leeway to do that. Now again, they don't do that by themselves. There's a process around this. The 10% leeway they have is not intended to be performance kinds of distinctions. But I would not stand up here and tell you that there's no correlation between a manager's perceived version of someone's contribution and these factors. For example, we believe that job complexity perhaps needs to be addressed in deviating from the algorithm. You could have two production supervisors, and one could be in a machining operation that's far more complex, works longer hours than an assembly operation, which runs a little bit smoother. And you may want to be able to recognize the differences in those jobs. Critical skills. We have engineers who have skills that we could readily identify as being short in the marketplace. Finite element analysis is a skill that is extremely difficult to buy in the open market, and you may want to have some extra funding that can recognize that skill and how difficult it is to achieve in the open market. Every function in our organization has gone through an analysis to determine what its critical skill shortages are within that function. In the personnel function, we even have skill shortages, and they're in the organizational development area because we believe that ought to be a secondary skill for any human resource professional. We also have a shortage of statistical skills in our function. Those two skills we will automatically recognize with added compensation beyond what the formula would generate, just as an example. Salary compression, if you remember that scatter plot, there's a lot of variation. Because there's a fixed fund every year to work with, even with the system generating larger increases for those that are further away from the curve, they may still be way off from their peers. So you may want to add extra compensation to some of those people who are really out of line with the rest of the people. And position, actually the description that I just went through has a lot more to do with position and range than salary compression. Salary compression would be where there's a supervisor-subordinate relationship and you wanted to address the differential. Again, the process requirements for spending this reserve fund are that we have a very clearly defined criteria. For each one of those, we've got a clear definition, and there has to be multifunctional support for that within a given plant or location. Of the 10% that we reserved, to utilize and address this criteria. Only half of it was spent to recognize these differences. The other half was folded back over everyone, so it was, we didn't throw it away. It was given to the employees. It wasn't allocated, however, based on this criteria. Only half of it was. So that was an important feedback for us for year 2 of what we might want to do. Because our managers were saying, I need a larger fund. I need to be able to distinguish more than you gave me in this 10% fund, when in fact they only used half of what they had. So that began to set the stage for some continuous improvement for year 2. The secondary fund that we have at our disposal, which makes this system more acceptable, I would say, for our employees, is a lump sum payment fund that we have. Our base pay money that I've described so far was funded, as an example, at 4% of our payroll last year. This fund is 3% of our payroll, and it's a one-time hit. Now, how would we factor that into the distribution of monies? We looked at some underlying assumptions. And we believe that while employees might understand limitations placed on their base pay, when they looked at the fact that their pay might be higher than everyone else's and that's why they're not getting an increase, they might understand that. They would not understand a deterioration in their standard of living given that there's this lump sum fund. So that, if we believed that, so that started to play out what the design should look like. So the concept was simple. The larger lump sum payments were given to those individuals who received smaller or no base pay increases to try and offset that pain, if you will, of not having had their base pay adjusted. And the concept, again, in a final summary would look like there's a base pay percent increase that someone would receive based on where they are in their pay range versus where they should be, plus a percentage of their pay in a lump sum payment that together would be greater than or equal to a minimum combined percent increase. As an example, if that minimum combined increase is 6%, then if an individual received only a 2% base pay adjustment, they would receive at least a 4% recognition award, or a lump sum payment. If they had a 4% base pay adjustment, they might receive a 2% lump sum payment. Now, many people received more than that in their base because of where they were positioned in their pay range. So not everyone got 6%. Some got significantly more than that, but everybody got at least that much in the two funds. How could we improve? This was really put together before we went through year 2, and we're now halfway through that. And the two areas that we felt we needed to focus on were how we went about identifying exceptional contributors. Were we comfortable with that? Were there places we could improve the process? And then how we spent that 10% reserve fund. So it was the two areas where we still had discretion, if you will, for judgment that we wanted to try and focus on. Believe it or not, in year 2, going into year 2, our managers were ready to discontinue identifying exceptional contributors. We would never have gotten them comfortable to do that in year 1. That was one of the most important features to them in year 1. But after having gone through it, by the time that we debriefed this exercise, they'd gone through it twice, and they felt that the effort that they expended to try and identify who these people were and sort out all their biases, it just wasn't worth it. They were spending far too much time on something that they were concluding was non-value added. The second area was in the reserve fund administration. We talked about why there was from one plant to another, there was differences in how people interpreted some of the criteria, how they spent the money, and we analyzed all of that data as a leadership group and significantly reduced the variation in year 2 just by having a common understanding across the division of what we mean by critical skills in a given function, and so on. So we were able to try and impact that element as well. I believe, again, just a closing quote that had meaning to us. And I'm going to focus on the last point. The aim of leadership is not to find and record the failures of men, but to remove the causes of the failure to help people do a better job with less effort. If we could focus less on judging people and put more of our time and effort into the processes that yield the results in the first place, our hope is that we'll all move ahead further than we have in the past. With that, I would like to turn it over to you for questions and any discussion you might want to have. There's some microphones up here, maybe to keep it organized. Maybe if we can use those. Go right ahead.
One question that comes to mind for something that doesn't deal with compensation, but more in a sense of rating. Could you please address an instance where an employee their performance may deteriorate in such a manner that they are under consideration for dismissal? Could you address that?
Sure. That's an important point, too. That actually, if you do something like this, you may be able to address more effectively than in the past. We do have individuals, like you've described, who we believe warrant some more intensive assistance or direction in their performance because we've concluded that they're not performing at a level that we believe to be acceptable. In the past, we have not been very good at stepping up and dealing with that. We've just sort of tolerated it, and we could not give those people increases, and they just float through the system over time. With the design of this system, and there's an important point that I forgot to tell you, and that is managers could not take away money that the system generated for somebody to give it to another individual. So they had to at least give what the system was recommending, unless it was a performance problem. And then we have a whole separate process for that. It's called a performance improvement plan. It's a very intensive process that would separate that person out. They would be dealt with with some intensive one-on-one coaching and assistance. They would not be eligible for an increase, and at the conclusion of that, they would either be performing back in the system or they would be, some other action would take place. They might be reduced in level of responsibility. They could lose their job. Things like that can happen. What this forced, and again, this is year 2 learning. In year 1, our managers had a lot of heartburn as we were going into this with these, quote, marginal employees who they didn't feel comfortable putting on a performance improvement plan. They didn't think they were that bad, but they didn't want to give them the increase that the system was recommending. The system kind of forces you to deal with that. And you'll go through enough heartburn giving them an increase that perhaps by year 2 you're not going to do that. We had a few more performance improvement plans and actions taken as a result of this system than in the past, because they could not deal with the discomfort of giving them the increase that they didn't feel they rightfully deserved. And again, this is our history. I don't know what yours would be like, but in our history, many of the, quote, marginal people are probably not marginal. They're probably individuals who do need to have some kind of intensive help to address their performance issues. Did that help?
Yeah. I'd like to follow up a bit.
Get rid of this.
Obviously, there are legal ramifications, and the system that you have been describing, essentially, is there more documentation in this system than really what appears? The area that I'm looking at is in a legal sense, in that, let's say if an employee is dismissed, no documentation leaves the company open to a lawsuit.
Oh, yeah. I didn't come in really prepared to talk through that process. If you are an individual who is not performing within the system on the low end and you need intensive help, there's a very legalistic-driven system to try and work through those issues. I will say that I have never felt more comfortable from a legal standpoint than I feel today in defending this system. I can honestly explain to any employee exactly how their increase was driven, when we have done some regression analysis and tried to look at pay differences between minorities and non-minorities, you know, what it should be, and look at the differences that you can't explain, those differences are going away because the system, its design is objective. And it's kind of hard to argue with that. So it's probably more defensible than it's ever been.
I think I see a definite step towards fairness or perception of fairness that will get out of the way in motivation in what you've expressed. But one of the things either I didn't hear or perhaps I don't understand is there does appear to be some distinction not on contribution so much, but on the perception of the value of a person's particular role. And is there not the potential that you're just transferring the problem with perceived fairness from the contribution distribution or valuing to the way that you value and distinguish between the perceived values of different roles? Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, I would say any place where you have discretion or subjectivity, and in this system it's in two places. It's in the identification of exceptional contributors, and it's in the spending of that 10% reserve fund. Anytime you have that kind of discretion, you run the risk of the biases that you've just described and what we described earlier in our old system. But our old system was completely designed off of complete flexibility. In this case, we've done the best we can to limit that. And yes, there is a small amount of money that has some discretion. There's also a very tightly defined process that we go through. It doesn't mean that the biases are completely eliminated, but I would ask you to remember the two customers again. If we were not ready to go cold turkey from a pay-for-performance system to taking completely away from managers all the discretion they had. So sometimes you need to think through longer term, where are you headed, and what are some good next steps that move you directionally where you want to go. For us, this was a real good next step, and even with that, has some heartburn associated with it.
Yes, I'd like to.
Oh, I'm sorry, we got it. Okay.
I need to clarify a point here. You made an illustration about the Halloween costume contest, and I got the impression that that was a sort of a bad situation. What about, you know, like for instance, in the communist system, they took away the carrot aspect of motivation, and now perestroika is bringing back the carrot. Can you clarify on that? To me, you know, rewards, carrots, they're, you know, they're a motivation and they're a part of capitalism.
The best way that I can characterize that, and I would be willing to take any help from the audience you want to offer, would be I would go back to our theory about whether or not pay is a motivator. If you believe pay is a motivator, then you've got the carrot and stick approach. If you believe that that's getting you what you want to get. We just don't believe that that was doing it for us. It was causing some people to win, again, at the expense of other people. It was not bringing people together for a unified approach and working in a team. So the reason I use that as an illustration, to me, it's a perfect example of, at a very early age, how our country recognizes individualism, recognizes the individual at the expense of someone else. And it would be nice that if we could get to the point of trying to put as much attention on what we could do if we worked more collaboratively together and focused on that, as much as we do on individualism, to me, that we would be far better off. We just don't, the games that are designed for children primarily don't do that. Candyland, somebody wins and somebody loses. You don't see them working together to accomplish something. And I guess I'd like to see the emphasis shifted a little bit.
My question is related in that what I'd like to hear about is how you let the market through to employees, because ultimately isn't that all you're trying to do by putting some spread in a compensation system? Example, I mean, statistical consultants that are paid by the day have a very clear performance rating, and some charge thousands of dollars and others grub for business at a couple hundred. And my question is, over time, the more I push employees towards some average, and if you buy that people are in fact normally distributed, wouldn't you expect, not over 2 years, people's compensation is not going to change much, but 5 years from now, 6 years from now, in fact, wouldn't I forecast that the people at the top end of that normal distribution will be the ones that ultimately will take other opportunities on the job market? In other words, I would worry that I'm going to lose the people I would most want to keep. Have you seen that? Do you expect it, and how do you address it?
Lots of ways to answer that. First of all, most of you probably already have a system that's called midpoint administration. Most companies operate that way. Midpoint administration means that you look at the open market, hopefully annually, and you determine yourself where you want to average your people in a given skill area in the open market. Some companies define that as the 50th percentile as competitive. Others might decide that you want to pay more than what the market is bearing so that you can attract people and pay them to the kind of caliber you want. You might peg your overall structure higher than the 50th percentile. But I would suggest that most of you already have a system that in a given pay range you are averaging to something. Now every year your system and ours probably indexes up to keep current with the outside market. If engineers, and they are, that their pay is going up at a faster rate than some non-technical areas, then their pay structure should probably move or index up along with that, so that you continue to stay current with what the external market is paying. So I guess I would say your whole structure has to move with the market, and at some point, for you to stay cost competitive, you've got to decide where you're going to average that, whether you want that to be above what most companies pay, or at what most companies pay, or do you want to pick out a few companies and keep pace with them? But that's more a pattern of your overall compensation structure, I think, than what I've described so far. Do you wanted to follow up on that?
Yeah, I was just worried about, I mean, still within that, there are still individual differences. And the question, you know, I mean, I'm really asking, wherever I build that, the more I pay people at the average, don't I build an incentive for the people at the top of that normal distribution to go somewhere else after better opportunities? So I understand the level, but within that.
Well, I almost have to answer your question, I almost have to go all the way back to the part of the presentation of, we don't believe everybody is the same. We have never told our employees, we believe you're all the same and we're going to pay you the same. What we have said is that we don't yet know how to separate our biases and judgments from the decisions we make about contribution. If you have a critical skill that is really hot in the market, we have the flexibility in the system to address that. So I guess with data to answer your questions, no, we have not seen a flood of people leave our organization out of a perception that if they go someplace else, they're going to make a lot more money. That's not, for us, that has not been a problem. Most people will leave the company, not, at least given where our pay is structured, not for that reason, but for other reasons, and some reasons that we're probably all struggling with, like in downsizing organizations, the perception that there's fewer opportunities for career advancement. We're more likely to lose somebody for that reason than we are this. This is not cause for exit in our company.
I was sort of interested in those 4 individuals who are rated as exceptional, because one of the points that's made about ranking systems is that not only do the people that don't get rated in the top category, not only do they feel disappointed about not having achieved it, some of the people in the top category, if they feel that they're just a consequence of common cause variability, feel guilty about having been put into that situation essentially by random chance. Did the people there feel they were there due to special cause or common cause variability? Do you know?
I don't, did everyone hear the question? The question was, for those people who were, the 4 people that were rated exceptional, did they feel they were there for special cause or common cause? I don't know that any of them would label it using those terms. I can tell you that, you know, to be 4 out of the number of people we're talking about, Yeah, you gotta ask yourself, you know, come on, am I really that different? And I know that those are the feelings that people have. So you're right, there's almost, you know, although managers and the company feel good in recognizing these people and their differences, the downside of doing that is you separate them again from the group and you make them feel different, and they're not so sure they like that. So that was one of the things that we discussed when we talked about should we discontinue this. The only reason we're continuing on with this right now is that we felt that we've only had 2 years of experience with this. We promised our employees that we would not make another change without a lot of data, so we really have 2 data points. And even in the 2 years that we've had with this, the number of exceptional contributors has been about the same, but the people changed. So you see there's variation there that we can't explain yet, and we're not comfortable doing away with it until we have a lot more experience. Did I answer your question?
Find a special cause. I mean, I guess that's one of the major points about if you've got a system which looks like common cause variability, and you notice a point which you think is an outlier in some sense, can you find a special cause because that helps you learn more?
Pull the whole system up. Yeah.
You pull the whole system up.
Yeah. To be honest, no, we haven't looked at it that way yet. That's a good insight.
Yes. Could you address how the system might affect or impact executive bonus plans and also profit sharing plans?
Did you plant that question? Remember when I said that we're a subsystem of a larger system? That's a real issue for us. Because in our company, executives are kind of corporate property. So to change the way we compensate executives is going to be taking on the most fundamental tenet in General Motors. And that's our next focus. I guess that's the best way I can put it. We really wish that we could have started all of this with our executive group and moved it down into the organization from there. We kind of started in the middle because we had some control over that. Even with that, we had a lot of battles to fight to gain complete control over that. The win that we had in our company is that we feel we had an awful lot of impact on General Motors' decision to decentralize the design of pay systems, recognizing the cultural differences from one division to a next. We put up such a stink over this whole thing that I'm convinced that we had a lot to do with that. So we've taken one major step, and the very next thing on our platter now is to try and go after that executive group so that we can align that. That's an extremely important thing to do, and I wish we could have started there.
Mary, I share a thought, and then I've got a quick question. 4 years ago, I heard Dr. Deming address the gentleman's question on the distribution of people performance. And the thought he shared is the same thing as the distribution and process output. It follows a normal curve, but if you understand SBC technology, you don't go tweaking the process between the lower and the upper control limit. And I think what you described is the upper and the lower control limit, and that's what Dr. Deming 4 years ago was trying to drive home. The question, I'm a supervisor. I have a young lady who does an excellent 40 hours of work, this is hypothetical, each week, plus an additional excellent 10 hours of work for 50 hours every week, does that routinely, sometimes goes to 55. I also have a divorced white male who has children, needs to be home after 40 hours of work. How do you handle that? Same quality 40 hours of the other match. How do you handle the differential in time with your system?
Before you walk away from the microphone, I want to ask you a question. How did you handle it before?
We have compensated the 50 hours with faster promotions, more money, bigger bonuses. If it was quality, if the additional 10 hours was quality in our judgment, as biased as it was.
So it's not so much the extra effort, it's the extra, what you believe are results that you're observing as well.
That's right. It has to be additional 25% quality hours, same quality as the first 40.
Okay. Because the reason that's an important distinction for me is there are lots of people who expend a lot of time at work But it doesn't necessarily mean their contribution is any different. So in this case, you're feeling there is.
That's right, and I agree with that, but there's also a lot of people who work 40-hour weeks who think that people work 50-hour weeks, they're wasting their time the last 10 hours.
Yeah.
And that's another side.
I guess the way I would answer that is in a very similar way that you've answered it. I think that that opportunities for advancement, if there is a difference in what you believe you're seeing, that somehow plays out in what happens to them longer term. Don't believe that the added compensation from at least the annual pay adjustment motivates one person to do any more or demotivates. The woman who works 50 hours is probably going to work 50 hours whether you pay her or not, because she's intrinsically motivated to do that. It's important to her to do a good job. I don't have all the answers to your question. What I do know is the place where we're trying to do a lot of improvement is the whole environment within which someone works. How do you recognize things like that without taking away from the group? And those are areas that we're trying to explore ourselves. Didn't believe that this system was the way to do it.
Taking my own life in the hand, I'm going to allow 3 more questions. One
Okay.
here, and then the 2 standing there, and then there will be some time, but otherwise you may be not going back to Michigan.
Okay.
Yes, it seems to me you run into a lot of these judgment-related and performance-related issues when it comes to promotion, similar to the way you do when it comes to compensation. Have you applied any of this type of thinking when it comes to deciding who gets the promotions?
Very good question. We have taken on 2 systems so far. We have replaced the appraisal system with a development system. That was step 1. Step 2 was to design a compensation system that did what we felt it was intended to do in the first place. The next obvious hole is, how do you promote people? And that is the question the organization is asking us to address. It's been coined, in fact, the 3rd leg of the stool, because that's the next piece that's out of sync with the other 2. I don't have all the answers to that. We have a concept that we've put in place that we're trying to build on, but it's in a concept stage right now. And it has more to do with having a better handle on what the specific skill requirements are for any given opening, and trying to match the skill requirements with the skills of the people that you have, which does not necessarily mean one person is better than another. It means there's a better match between the opening and the person. So that's the concept, and we're trying to design a computer system, a survey system, a lot of information that would be needed to make that happen. That's going to be far more complex than these 2 that we've tackled so far. Yes?
Just at a comment, there's been a lot written about separating pay increases from evaluating someone's performance in terms of time. Doing one, say, in June, evaluating someone's performance in June and giving them a pay increase in December or something. Does your system look at what the base pay is and then calculate the increase? Is that all done right at the same time? And then does that give the person the feeling that he's still kind of being paid, or his increase is tied to his performance? It gives him that feeling that I'm getting this increase based on what I've done, not related to the system that you've developed.
No, there's a complete separation in the 2 systems. The performance development or individual development system is driven off of service date. It's entirely focused on what you do well and what you could do better. It has features in it like multiple input that's required from peers and subordinates and so on. That's all done driven off of service date, as I said. The base pay increase is driven off of time since your last increase. They're completely separate, and in fact, the line of communication to the employee when you give them their increase is not at all related to contribution. The words that a supervisor uses, which, by the way, was a difficult transition for our supervisors, doesn't even touch on contribution, unless you're one of those 4 people. It's completely separate. Completely different conversations, different points in time.
Mary, first a quick question for information. Some of your slides have been changed since the book was put together. Would it be possible to get updated copies?
What I will do is get some information to the folks that orchestrated all of this, that have the slides in it from what you've seen. And then if you'd care to get a copy of that, can they contact?
Yes. Yes.
Would it be Debbie Ray?
Thank you. And then
Okay.
the other question was partly answered by your response to how are you going to handle performances? And it was along the lines of, if you don't identify your exceptional performers, is there a feeling of something lacking in the organization, because then how are you going to know who to promote? You gave quite a different answer based on skills and experience for a job. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the differences between those two approaches.
If I'm not answering this directly, let me know. But in my mind, promotability is not necessarily the same as being an exceptional contributor. You could be an exceptional engineer, but not be promoted into a managerial kind of position because of the entirely different skill set that would be required for that job. So that's why if you looked at the 4 exceptional contributors we had, they weren't all necessarily what we would call high potential employees. In fact, I think only 1 of the 4 was. The other 3 were just considered exceptional at the job that they did. You could have an exceptional secretary who's gone as far as that person's going to go in that field. So I see those as 2 different things driven off of different criteria. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think you make the point well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary.